Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee. And thought I would do a video for you guys and gals. It's one of the things I notice in comments and arguments is the sheer amount of anti-science rhetoric you see when it comes to nutrition. And what people will make these statements they don't realize is they're basically just parroting other people themselves. You know, they have this idea that if we're discussing science and they haven't read any of it, now keep that in mind, they haven't looked at any of the studies themselves that they're talking about, almost never. They're just quoting fringe experts and chiropractors and conspiracy theorists with these things without even bothering to look at stuff. And what they don't understand, they're like, oh, you're just parroting government policy. And we're usually not. We're looking at studies around the world. And just being a follower, but then they're doing the same thing, except that the people they're following may not have any credibility. Okay, so you need a context for that. So when you really look at this, you know, everyone, I'm seeing stuff like, well, you can't trust science and you can't trust meta-analysis, and they bring politics into it. They bring issues of government policy into it. Okay, when I find that fascinating, they say that, but the arguments they make aren't even about studies. Their arguments are about media and government policy. And they're not even arguing science. I'm not going to say which issue because I think we all know which one, big one they always say when they're like, oh, they told you to trust the science. What's wrong with looking at the science and saying, yeah, this is a pretty good way to analyze things? Because without science and without data, what are you doing? You're just being ignorant. And the thing is, most of the science, when you look at the nutrition stuff, it admits its own flaws and its imperfections. You know, and a lot of times what you're seeing with nutrition, you do see patterns. I mean, in a perfect example, and people will argue, oh, well, this is the studies then debunk this, but they haven't. Studies haven't debunked that there could be issues with saturated fat. Like, where are you getting this? Because when you look at the sum total of the data, I mean, go look at meta-analysis on overall longevity, all-cause mortality, diseases, obesity. Okay, there's a really well-done meta-analysis that look at everything and studies across the world that show that there are patterns. And those patterns doesn't mean that every single person falls into that niche. Yes, it is possible for a person to snort cocaine their whole life and live to be 65. Okay. People always use things lesser than that, you know. They drink alcohol, or they do it. Okay, well, fine. But statistically, they probably won't. Right? I'm going to recommend that you don't do that if you want to live to be 65. They beat the odds. Hey, maybe they should have bought a lottery ticket. That would be my response, you know, and that's illogical. So you look at dietary patterns. What do the patterns show? They show that most of the stuff that people say was probably bad for you does seem to be to some extent. But it's not saying avoid good, bad. We're saying look at the patterns in the eating behavior. And again, you look at patterns in eating behavior. People, and when you look at sliding scales of eating patterns, there are enormous distinct patterns that stand out. Okay, people who eat less animal source fat, who consume, well, this is always the thing, who consume less refined sugars and drink less alcohol, tend to live longer, have less body fat, less cancer, less heart disease, less diabetes. Okay, that's what studies show. Notice I didn't say replace one of those with another, and that seems to be the arguments that go back and forth. You know, with these extremists who are anti-science. Well, I'm just going to avoid all these table sugars and all this carbohydrate and replace with saturated fat. Well, you're still not following any of those rules, and you're still not going to benefit in the long term. You're probably going to suffer for it. And vice versa on the other extreme. I'm going to avoid all animal fats and just replace it with a bunch of heavily refined sugars and heavily refined carbohydrates. Okay. Well, That's not going to work out too well for you. But that's what studies show. They also show that on average, people who consume more fruits and vegetables, more whole grains, more legumes, nuts, right, tend to have lower rates of these diseases on average. And when we say tend to, we mean pretty extreme. Not saying it's 100% across the board, not saying there's not a single healthy person who eats a bunch of junk, appears to be healthy. Not saying people who eat well don't occasionally have cancer. Okay? We're not saying this. We're talking about pretty large evidence. And then they'll argue with science, and then they don't want to look at the actual stuff in the lab, because these are population studies, epidemiology. But then you look in the lab and they'll say, well, you can't make this statement. Really, you can. Like, we can look in the lab, and it's been done when literally people's different types of fat are eaten for large amounts. We can study it in the lab. We can study fat oxidation. We can study changes in insulin sensitivity, all this stuff, and it's all been done. It's been done. There are definite trends that can be seen there. In other words, even say take monounsaturated fat, so we can differentiate certain differences that happens in the body, positive and negative, even with your monounsaturated, whether it's a primarily an animal or a plant source, because there are specific fatty acids. It's not because it's always animal, it's because the literal what's in those foods. But then people make arguments about history. They appeal to nature. Well, if we weren't meant to eat this or that, why? That's irrelevant. That's completely irrelevant. Our evolutionary pattern doesn't determine, from 1 million years ago, doesn't determine what will make us live longest and cause the lowest cancer today. That's not really a factor. It really isn't. And people make this appeal to nature. But people didn't live that long. They didn't live long enough to get heart attacks. And then they ignore what's happened with gene flow in the last few thousand years. People need to understand certain things with gene flow and adaptation to food can happen within 1,000 years. Okay, you need to understand that, especially, with a prolific population, right? Hopefully people understand that. In other words, you today, you as a human who came from whatever region of the world, I promise you, your exact gene flow and the enzymes and things that you produce regarding even nutrition are not identical to a human 20,000 years ago, pulled out of whatever tribe. I promise you they're not the same. Okay? Agriculture, society, these things affect gene flow for these things. It absolutely does. And that's why we study these things. That's why we look at them. And without looking at the things that are happening in the lab and the trends, you're just randomly picking. And there comes a point where people need to admit that that's what they're doing. It's simply their excuse because they want to continue bad habits, and that's fine. Just say that. But don't pretend that it's based upon data. And again, these assumptions, what people forget when they say, well, there could be corporate bias or whatever, and companies bias, and that does happen in studies all the time. So look at it. But here's your issue with that. That's usually inside of individual countries. It's not global. Okay? It's not global. And there is a bias in studies in the U.S. for certain things, absolutely. And people, when you tell them what it is, they don't want to hear it. So I'm not going to go, because it actually debunks their idea. It makes their side look worse. When they realize the most financial bias is towards what they're trying to push. Okay? And the silliest idea you ever hear is that agriculture, companies that grow crops, the agricultural industry wants you to do certain things. Really? Because they benefit from you eating meat. That's the silliest thing I've ever heard. What do you think they grow those animals on that you're eating? You know how many grains it takes to fill out? How many soybeans and all that stuff it takes to fill out the feedlot cattle you're eating? Okay, that's a big money maker for them. What are you talking about? And we have to have crops. We have to have them. They're essential. There's no way you're getting rid of it. They don't need to do that. As long as there are human beings that need to eat food, or there's livestock that needs to be fed out for humans to eat, they have unlimited customers. Stop being silly. And the same thing, people will talk about government policy, as if that has in fact impacted anything. I mean, people want to literally pretend that anyone ever followed the food pyramid as a population. Really? You really think that happened? Because that's not what I see. When I see what the average American eats, I don't see the average American living on a diet of whole grains and vegetables with moderately low fat. I don't see it. What are you talking about? They live on junk food, live on garbage. So you have that. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys next time.